In this chapter, we look at the government's role in managing the economy. And whenever the government gets involved in managing the economy, we call that fiscal policy. So, I'm just going to skip over this for right now. Um, so, these next two chapters look at two ways that you could get involved in the economy. This chapter, for chapter 9, we're looking at fiscal policy. And there's basically two things, and only two things, that the government can do to um, adjust the economy. And that would be to spend more or less, or tax more or less. And those are the only two things you can do. Only two things. So let's write that out here. Only spending money or collecting money, which takes the form of taxation. When you hear monetary policy, this is all about changing the money supply, where the triangle stands for delta, or changing. Okay, so there's two ways that the government can act to then change spending and taxing. It can either make a conscious decision to change things, so this would be called discretionary fiscal policy. So, great examples of this, one would be obviously COVID, right? So, disease happens, government realizes it needs to do something, and then it does something. Um, September 11th would be another example. Even the 2008 2009 financial crisis would be another example. Basically, you've got an event, government officials, politicians, realizing they better do something, otherwise, they won't get voted back into office. And so then they do something, and that something that they do is spending or taxing. And what we're looking at here is we have to look at the way in which government spending and taxation, how that affects net income or disposable income. This would be basically income you have left after taxes, which then you can presumably spend, right, on consumption. So we have two, as a household or even as a business, there are two interaction points. Those two interaction points would be that um, you can um, tax less so that people have more money, or you can increase the transfer payments, meaning you give families, households, more money that they can then spend. So, examples that we've seen would be, for instance, during the Trump administration, um, tax levels went slightly down. And the idea would be that households could then choose to spend that money. Or during the Biden administration, um, those with children received a child tax credit, which they could then spend that money. So that child tax credit serves as a transfer payment. And then obviously we all have taxes. And if those taxes are reduced, our disposable income would go up as well. And so if we wanted to understand this in a circular flow diagram, which, to be honest, as I look at it, it really complicates what's otherwise a simplistic thing. Um, I just laughed that they think that this looks any clearer. You know what? I'm just going to skip this. I don't think that this is. To me, it doesn't make more sense. And um, you can look, if it makes sense to you, by all means look. I mean, it makes sense to me, but I don't think it makes things clearer on its own. So I'm just going to skip over it. You wouldn't see any exam questions specifically about this circular flow of income. But the equations do make a little bit more sense, at least to me. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. So here we've got disposable income. And we're essentially saying that with disposable income, it can go to one of two things, and only two things. We either use it to spend it on, so consumption, or we save it. Okay, so how do we get disposable income? Disposable income has this equation. So disposable income is determined by total income minus taxes. Given the way that this formula is made, so let's erase this little part here. Okay. Is that if disposable income is the same as this, let's substitute the two, and then add t to each side, which then gets us this. And in a balanced government, balanced budget situation, t equals g, which then means we can substitute g for t, where G stands for government spending, T stands for taxes. That government spending is part of the aggregate expenditures. Which is just the total spending that's going on inside the economy. Now, as we all know, governments don't always spend only what they've collected in taxes. In fact, more often than not, at least in most economies, they spend more than they bring in. Thus, they generate what's called a deficit. There are rare times in U.S. history where we've run a surplus. The last time was in 2000, I believe, maybe 2001. I think it was 2000. That was during the second Bush administration. It was coming on the heels of very strong economic growth throughout the 1990s. And also during the Clinton administration, the Democrat, there were reforms made to the social network, basically the I hate to call it just welfare, but in 1996, the Clinton administration passed what was called the Personal Responsibility Act, which basically imposed all these work requirements, limits on how long you could collect payments from the government if you didn't have a job, etc. Well, that resulted in the government spending less money and the government collecting much more in taxes, and it generated a surplus, at least for a year, maybe two. Most of the time, though, it's a deficit. In fact, we've run deficits since occasional times where we've run a surplus, but we basically seem to run a deficit most years in and out. So, our consumption is also has a function. Now, this becomes important because what this determines, in some senses, how effective or useful government spending would be, because it can lead to more consumption. So here what we're saying is that the consumption function has two parts. It has what could be called an autonomous part. Autonomous meaning it doesn't change with the level of income. So an example of this would be, let's say, I need a certain amount of food to survive every month. So the base minimum would be, let's say, I don't know, $40 a month. I know it's a very low number, but let's just say on $40 a month, I only buy beans in bulk at the dollar store, and that's all I eat every day for a month. I don't know. I'm sure it costs more than $40, but maybe let's just say I eat a bag of beans a day. um, it'd be pretty rough, but I suppose you could do it. Not many people would want to, but that's the base minimum you need to survive, to live another day. And then what we're saying is that then a fraction of my disposable income I devote to other spending. So now, if this is just beyond food, let's just say the base amount to live, I don't know, is $1,000 a month. I don't know, basic studio apartment in a really cheap area, as cheap as you can get, basic food, basic amount of living to survive. And then we're saying that for every dollar you earn, you devote a portion to consumption. So we're saying here that consumption then equals 1,000, and I'm just going to make up this number, plus 0.8 YD. And so this is saying here that I spend 80% of every dollar after taxes. I'm making up this number, but that's kind of a way to understand this function. That's going to become important because if I'm in the government and I find a way to deliver more disposable income to households, what I know is that that household is going to spend 80% of that amount. And that's going to generate additional economic growth in this economy. Now, what we also know too, and this was more of the focus that the Trump administration took, which is why when I say things like the Trump tax plan, and some of you may think, how did that really affect my household? It may not have, to be honest. Given where the state of life that many of you are in right now. Even for my in my household, my wife's business is it's considered independent. So what that means is that she has to declare certain things, like if she buys a new computer, that's an investment that has to be depreciated over time. And the Trump tax plan made it so that assets were treated differently, and obviously a way that helped our household, reduce the amount that it was spending on taxes. I don't think I have a very typical household, in the sense that um, I'm not sure I needed as a household a tremendous amount of help, given my economic situation. And I say that because not as a critique of what the Trump administration did, although I am kind of, I want you to, one could say, and this would be the counter argument. The counter argument would be is that if my wife then, if she's paying less in taxes, she can presumably, I don't know, hire an additional employee, spend more money in other things, and that stimulates the economy. That's the argument that's made, and that's used to justify why they did what they did. The problem with that is that she did none of those things. So, that's not atypical either. Okay. The equilibrium in the economy, then, as we're trying to find the equilibrium in the way that government spending then can alter the economy, is that we're saying here that equilibrium is found where income is equal to aggregate expenditures. That's where equilibrium is occurring. and that aggregate expenditures is also equal to C plus I plus G, consumption plus investment plus government spending. If we then just substitute that, that's where you get this right here. So there's our equilibrium in our economy: consumption, investment, and government spending. Now, we can track this in a table, and that's where it's kind of useful, because here, if we're looking at the overall equilibrium point for the economy, if we want to walk through this and see how the economy is affected, then what we can see here is that for every output level or income level, such as it's 300. So then if we subtract the 100, we're left with a disposable income here. So Y subscript D, that stands for disposable income. And so then I can solve this, right? So I can then say that consumption equals 100 plus 0.75 of 200. That's equal to 250. Right, and I would just keep going down the line. And that's the easiest way to solve this. Just solve this column by column and go down all the rows. So solve it column by column. So then I've got my 250. My savings would be, what do I have left of disposable income after consumption? So savings is column 3 minus column 4. Column 3 minus column 4. So now solve this down the line. Okay, now investment. Investment is fixed, so I don't have to change anything here. I just write the same number down the column. Government spending, same thing. Write the same number down the column. Column 8. Here we're adding columns 4, 6, and 7. Okay. And then in column 9, I'm taking column 1 and I'm subtracting column 8. Equilibrium will be where there's no unplanned change in inventory. 0. So what this signifies for us here is that fluctuations in the economy, and this is kind of the Keynesian insight here, that fluctuations in the economy come from unplanned changes in inventory. And so at that output level of 900, the economy is in equilibrium. When it's not at output, meaning column 1, when it's not at 900, either the economy is slowing down or it's speeding up. And that then causes changes in the economy. But then generally, the government gets involved in trying to change. Now, we can understand this as well with a graph, and maybe this makes it a little bit clearer. So let's draw a 45-degree line first. That's the first thing to do, this black line right here. Actually, let's draw it in real life too. So what you'll notice is Y is on the x-axis, Y meaning the income. Aggregate expenditures is on the y-axis. These aggregate expenditures are the planned aggregate expenditures. And at a 45-degree line, and I'm going to erase that here, but at a 45-degree line, at all of these points, our income or output, it's the same thing, our income output would equal our planned aggregate expenditures. What that means is that our equilibrium has to exist somewhere along that 45-degree line. Because along that line, there are no unplanned changes in the inventories. And what we saw already in that previous table is that investment levels were fixed, government spending was fixed, so that's your I and G, but the consumption changed. It had a non-zero intercept, right? That was the A term, right? The amount they need to survive or whatever it is, plus a portion of my disposable income. That right there is going to be my autonomous consumption plus G plus I. So let's say, actually, let's look at what the, without changing this, I have it printed out here. So we do 100 plus 100 plus 100. So in some sense here, we can see 100 plus 100 plus 100. Add that together, right? Here's our one. It's right here. 200 plus 100. Add that together. That gets us starting at 300. Now, the taxes equal 100. So 100 plus 0.75. If the income is 0, 0.750 minus 100, that would be 100 plus 0.75, sorry, plus 75. So consumption equals 175 at income level 0. Oh, sorry, wrong term here. Sorry, plus and negative. Sorry about that. Some of you were probably looking at that and saying, Shining, what are you up to? 100 minus 75. Sorry about that. Is 25. So consumption equals 25 at income level 0. And all I did here is just substitute a 0 level income into my original consumption function. So at y equals 0, consumption equals 25, I equals 100, G equals 100, and that's what equals 225, which is this right here. And then for every dollar that the income goes up, planned expenditures goes up by 0.75. So now the slope of this is 0.75. For every $100 increase in income, aggregate expenditures goes up by 0.75 or 75. Here, you're not exactly seeing it that way because it's increasing here by units of 200. But for every $200 increase in Y, um, we're increasing our consumption by 150, which is essentially 75 times 2. Okay. Okay. And so then the other part to this is looking at savings and investment. Those need to equal as well in equilibrium. Um, and here, what we're saying is that when an economy is in equilibrium, that the level of savings plus taxation, things that basically stop us from consuming, would have to equal the level of planned investment plus the government spending. And then we can rearrange those terms. But again, your use of this right here is not that much, so I'm not going to spend much more time on it than what I have. Now, why did we go through all of that? Like, what does that do for us? Well, what it does is it helps us understand a little bit a very important force in when the government spends money, known as the multiplier. And what that multiplier basically says is that when the government spends money, people receive that money and then they spend it. So the child tax care credit, although, the intent probably, not probably, but the intent of the Biden administration was to, reduce childhood poverty. Certainly, like who wants childhood poverty? At the same time, the idea was families aren't just going to save that money, including my household, right? What I did with the money is my family spent it. We used it to pay for daycare for our youngest child, who may have just been watched at home otherwise. And so, because of that, right, we then enroll the child in um, daycare, and that daycare then has one more student involved, and that one student um, then they have to hire more workers or more supplies or something, and that money keeps getting spent on and on and on. So there is a government spending multiplier, as we'll see. There's a tax multiplier, which means that when taxes go up, there's less income that can be spent. And there's also a balanced budget multiplier that affects the economy. And so we're going to look at each of these three. Let's start first with the government spending multiplier. So in the government spending multiplier, what we're saying here is that that one term that we looked at, right, when we said consumption equals 100 plus 0.75 YD, disposable income, that 0.75, the portion of my disposable income that I then devote to consumption, is called my marginal propensity to consume. Marginal propensity to consume. And if I do 1 over 1 minus marginal propensity to consume, what that generates for me is the government spending multiplier. What that is saying is that for every dollar spent by the government, that the total change in the equilibrium level of output is 4. Not only the $1 spent by the government, but the 3 additional dollars by that flow, right? Me spending the money at the daycare then spending more money for other things, and so on and so forth. And we see that here. when the government spends $50 more, right? So let's write this out here. If the change in G equals 50, just writing this out again. Then my equilibrium level of output, in income has to have increased by 200. And indeed it did. It went from 900 to 1100. We see that right here. Okay. And essentially, if we wanted to look at this graphically, the way we would understand this is that it essentially um, um, shifts the um, aggregate expenditure function up by that amount of government spending, and that's what we see right here. Now, the tax multiplier, on the other hand, also changes the level of the equilibrium. And here the equation is slightly different. So now it's my marginal propensity to consume over my marginal propensity to save, the negative of that ratio. In this case, it would equal the negative of 0.75 over 0.25. So MPS and MPC always have to equal 1. So that's how I got the 0.25 here. Right. And so what this is going to tell us is how much things change overall, the equilibrium level changes overall. So in this case, it's 3 out, and the 4 is just carrying over from before. And with the balanced budget multiplier, what we're seeing here is that what the balanced budget multiplier does is because we're not going to generate a deficit, basically, the change in government spending, the multiplier that generates that change in government spending, is going to offset the changes in taxes along with the deficit. So the reason for that then is that the balanced budget multiplier is always 1. It's the same. Having a balanced budget multiplier doesn't really do anything to change the economy. And we see that here, right? That in that equilibrium where I increase G and T by 200, then the equilibrium just simply goes up by that same 200. It went up from 900 to 1100. So you basically lose any of them. You lose the multiplier effects of the money. The two basically cancel each other out. It's somewhat of a helpful chart. I'm not sure. It's not useful, but it is what it is. And all that this slide is telling us here is that the reality is obviously a lot different. The reality is that people pay taxes as a portion of their income. And so, because people spend a portion of their income, our treatment of doing things with um, a fixed amount, that's obviously not realistic. Okay, so let's look at the budget itself now. The budget is basically going to consist of both the amount brought um, in the form of various taxes, and what's spent, the various expenditures. And the difference between those is going to generate a surplus or deficit. This data is from 2017. Update it. Mm, let's test out whether this is accurate. So it was saying that in 2017, about 42. Yeah, okay, so it's accurate. Okay, so let's see what it is now. So it's about 59.52 in expenditures. Not for nothing. But what I just did right there, looking up current data, what I really am hoping is that after this course is done, that's one of the things that you can now do. You don't have to take, what's the point of college, right? College is meant to empower you in some way, not just remember, you know, stupid definitions. They're not stupid, but you know what I mean. Um, it's a skill set. And that's what I hope you're getting right here, right? I saw here the data was old. I know that there's a resource, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, that I can then go to update that data. And I can see here it's 59.52 billion. Now let's get the receipts. So I'm just typing in federal government receipts. Let's just test the data to make sure we're kind of using the same numbers. 3587. Got a problem here. So it can't be just tax receipts. It's got to be just current receipts, maybe, because we did current expenditures. Yeah, there we go. That's about correct. So right now it's 4303. Uh-oh. Actually, if we want to generate it the same way, if we want to use the same equation here, the deficit surplus would be receipts minus expenditures. So it would be 4303 minus 5952. Negative 1649, so about negative $1.6 trillion. Let's test whether that's accurate or not on our simple calculation. $1.18 or 1186 basically. Why is that different? Oh, because it's not doing it on a yearly basis. So the problem here is doing it on a monthly basis. And so we have months like January where people are paying their taxes and the amount is pretty big. So I'm just going to change this to be annual. All this data we've been doing has been so we're getting a little bit of a difference here, but there's obviously some other things going on in the government budget deficit, but we got a number pretty darn close. 2147 versus 1649. Not too bad. I mean, I just did kind of a quick kind of look here. I'm not going to worry about it. We got something approximately correct. If we look at this deficit, yeah, dude, it looks pretty bad. This would be pretty bad. Yeah, these are historically high deficits that we had because of the pandemic. And not for nothing, but the deficit actually did grow. I don't mean this as a critique against any president. I would never want to be president. I have no desire to be a president. It sounds like a pretty bad job. I don't understand why anyone would want to do it. And the deficit actually got worse during the Trump administration. Deficit actually improved during the Obama administration. But again, I don't think determination of the federal budget is a pretty complicated process. And you can't just either blame or reward the president. It's also Congress as well that determines these things. But here we can see our very brief period of time in 1999 and 2000 and 2001, where we did have a surplus for a short period of time. That would be on an annualized basis. Where is it going to, I guess? Where is it coming from? Where's the receipts coming from? Where's the expenditures going out? So here we've got our current receipts. Again, all this is data that's coming from 2017. You don't have to rely on this. We could update all of this going to Fred, and we could do that, but I'm not going to do it here. We see that most of the money that comes in taxes comes from you and I, personal individuals paying our taxes. It is not coming from corporations, which make up only 10%. The other big chunk besides our personal income taxes is this contributions for social insurance. That would mean what we pay out in terms of Social Security and Medicare taxes. And that's the bulk of the money that's coming in for the government. Us paying our taxes on income and us paying taxes for social insurance. In terms of where's the government spending its money, well, consumption expenditures, meaning the government just spending money on the things that it like builds bridges, things like that. That's military. That's 23%. Paying money to individuals directly. That would mean Social Security, disability payments, payments to the poor, all those kinds of things. That's half the money. And then giving money to state and local governments in terms of grants and whatnot, that's 13%. And then the other big chunk here is just keeping the debtors off our back, meaning making interest-only payments on the debt is another 12% almost. And obviously we have a shortfall. A shortfall that's actually pretty big, comparatively speaking, as a percent. This is a pretty interesting chart because, again, I'm saying, I don't want you to read this graph as then either blaming or celebrating a particular president, because a president does not make a budget. A budget, the blame and the rewards go all around Congress and the president, right? Don't you remember this? Taking any kind of government class? So, um, we can see that if we just look at this chart here, during the Clinton administration, um, that tax rates went up as a portion of taxable income and then fell during the Bush administration to a pretty low level here on the end of the 2001 recession. And then as taxable income grew, taxes grew, and that brought us to the 2008 crisis, which during the Obama administration, then again, we saw that increase. So the increase here is just because the economy is doing well, and taxes brought in are going up because households are realizing more income. Then when the economy enters a recession, income goes down, so tax levels, you're right, you've got less that you can tax. So during the Trump administration, we would imagine this level would be going up because households got more income. Then if we look at what the government spent on expenditures, like again, buying military equipment, bridges, all those kinds of things, versus what they spent in transfer payments and grants and aids. Again, you can kind of see those trends here. That basically the government's becoming a smaller player as the economy is getting larger and larger. And that when we hit a recession, the government then spends more money and the economy's smaller. And so you see this peak here because then the economy is at its smallest and the government's spending more money because of the state of the economy. And then it declines. And this would have kept declining during the Trump administration, up to a certain point, because one of the focus of the Trump administrations was actually to spend more on the military. And so you would have seen some small increases there up until the COVID-19. Then you would have seen a dramatic increase both in terms of expenditures, but also dramatically in terms of transfer payments, which is our lighter blue line here. And again, you see then those changes in the surplus and the deficits. Again, don't blame a president, blame and celebrate both a president and a Congress. Now, the government agency in charge of projecting what the deficit's going to be in the future is the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO. And right now, and this is all before COVID-19, we could try to update this. Let's see. That's the website. It is a study here of how accurate are their projections. Interesting. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read this right now. But you could. CBO.gov, publication number 55234. Read it. I don't know. It's before, again, COVID-19, so I'm not sure, how valuable that is. But one of the things we're seeing here is that the long-term projection for the deficit is going to keep growing because the population keeps getting older. And two of the things that happen would be is that you're going to spend more on Medicare, healthcare for the old, and you're going to spend more on Social Security. Now, as we look at that debt, um, the debt is the total amount owed by the federal government. But then there's actually two portions of it. There's privately held federal debt, and then there's actually publicly held federal debt. The publicly held federal debt would be the biggest one would be Social Security. Social Security is forced to hold U.S. government debt, treasuries, and we can look at what that is. Publicly held federal debt. And we can see here that that as certain agencies were capturing more money, they were forced to hold that amount. And plus, as the economy had a larger amount of debt that could be purchased by these government agencies, that would be what we'd see here. And then we could have privately held debt, which also should be obviously growing here. The other large holder of U.S. government debt outside of Social Security would be the central bank, the Federal Reserve, which we look at in the next chapter. Again, don't blame the president, but you can see that the debt level, not just the deficit, so the deficit is the accumulation of the debt is the accumulation of deficits over time, and that debt is growing as well, and it currently exceeds GDP. You can see this right here. It dramatically, about the time that the book was published, so it's, it was kind of flirting with going slightly above 100. And don't focus too much on the fact of how it exists versus 100. An economy is neither stronger or weaker just because it exceeds 100. It just exceeds 100. But now we can obviously see that it's pretty large, 122% of GDP. Now the GDP is growing, so this is obviously coming down, and this large increase came from the fact that not only did the debt grow dramatically, but the economy shrunk. And so that's what we're kind of seeing going on right here. Now, in the economy, what we're seeing is that there are, in the way that the government budget is structured, is that there are what are called automatic stabilizers and destabilizers. What this means is that as an economy does well, there are certain things that happened automatically without government officials even having to decide to do something. So it's not discretionary anymore, right? We started this lecture by saying that we had some discretionary payments that would go out, and those discretionary payments would go out because the government would say, oh man, we need to do something. And unfortunately, that takes time. So one of the problems of an economy, of waiting for an economy to just do something, is that because it takes a certain amount of time for things to happen, and you don't want to wait for things to happen like that, um, one of the things that you would do instead is you would basically push the economy um, automatically. So what we know is that as the economy does well, it'll start to um, it'll start to bring in more money because we're all earning more money, so we'll pay more in taxes. And that one of the other things that we'll see that happens is that as the um, government does, or as the economy does poorly, that the government will take in less money because, um, in this case, take in less money because uh, taking less money because we're out of a job. Um, and also, what's happening is that the government's going to spend more money, and it's going to spend more money during a recession because um, people are going to have to get food stamps. They're going to have to get, various forms of government assistance. And when the economy is doing well, the government's going to spend less money, and it's going to spend less money because um, fewer people are going to need to be on government assistance of various kinds. Now, those things happen automatically. What's nice about that is that we then don't have to wait for economic change to occur. The other side to this would be that when um, the economy can also be destabilized, and one of the ways it can become destabilizing would be if the government, when the economy is doing well, if there's some portion of the budget where um, well, actually, I mean, I'm actually fine doing it in this case. One of the critiques that could be made of the one of the critiques that could be made of the Trump budget would be, again, not just Trump, it's again everyone owns the problem here, but the problem of the Trump budget would be that it was stimulating the economy in 2017 when the economy really didn't need a lot of stimulation. So what it would cause is the economy to actually overheat a little bit more, and that would be something um, that we could see. Um, and then the other thing is that we have a portion of this known as fiscal drag. And what fiscal drag, the way that it happens is that the way that the income tax system works is that we have income tax brackets that you earn a certain level of income, and then your tax percentage changes. As that tax percentage changes, um, individuals, as they're being taxed more, um, that means that it's going to mean that the economy um, is going to be hurt to some extent because individuals are going to have less income that they can spend. That's going to be collected by the government. Now, something useful to calculate for any government would be to calculate what's known as the full employment budget. What this is it's basically what would the um, budget, what would it look like if the economy was at its full employment level? Meaning that the amount of the budget changes as the economy goes through its various cycles. And so we may have a deficit caused only by the cycle of the economy, which is actually not something to be concerned about. What is more concerning is the extent that we've been generating um, deficits, as we saw in that chart. We were generating government budget deficits during economic good times, such as during the Trump administration, which for the most part was a strong economic performance. Um, and so, if we're running a deficit, then you got a much bigger problem, because what that means is that the the budget needs to be restructured to make it sustainable, and it doesn't have that right now. Okay. Um, that I'm not going to cover the appendix here, so you do not need to worry about that.